Welcome to the Painting Coach, and today I'm going to show you how to paint Gelgus Pust, the big bad from the brand new Warhammer Quest Darkwater box set. A huge thank you to Games Workshop for sending me this box set early so I can make this content. Now, I'm really chuffed with how Gelgus Pust has turned out. There's a little bit of experimentation in this video, so sit back, relax, and enjoy. Let's get painting. The first thing I've done is prime the model using Mechanicus Standard Grey, and that's because I wanted a fairly neutral tone to jump off of. I think if I'd gone with black, it would have been too dark for some of the layering that I wanted to do, but if that's all you've got, it's absolutely fine. The first thing to do is to base all of the armor and any other bits that are going to be silver. Now, you might be wondering, hang on, that armor looked pretty green at the start. Well, I'll show you how to do all that, but we need to get the metallic base coat down first. Now, the color I'm using for this is dark aluminium from Vallejo Model Color. If you haven't got this, lead belcher is absolutely fine, and I'm going to show you how to use lead belcher on this later on anyway. So don't worry if you haven't got both, lead belcher is completely fine. We just want to make sure we cover everything that is either going to be an armor panel or is going to be silver. And we've also got that mace as well. So whilst that's rusty, we are going to base it with silver to start with. Once we've got that done, we're now going to shade it all down using some Nurgle oil. So we want to paint this all over all of the bits that we've just painted silver, making sure we get it into all the recesses. Now, one important thing with this is that we don't just slap it on, because we don't want any heavy pooling of this in certain areas. Now, as you let it dry, you'll see that it does start to pool in some places. Just very quickly wick it away and suck it up with a dry brush so that it doesn't give you that really ugly kind of dark pooling, because it's quite hard to fix that sometimes. Once that Nuln oil is completely dry, and it's very important that it's completely dry, we're then going to shade it all again using some Agrax Earthshade. Now, this is building up a little bit of discoloration, it's building up a little bit of texture, it's building up some other colours, and this is essentially underpainting for when we go for the green metallic later on. Very similar to the Nuln oil, it's really important that we work this into all of those recesses. It's really important that we get it into all the pocked parts of the armour to give a darker colour across there and into all the joins. Again, we want to avoid it pooling too heavily in the recesses or towards the bottom of armor plates. So if it does start to do that, just wick it away very quickly. Once that's completely dry, we'll then go in with some lead belcher and an old synthetic brush. And I'm just going to stipple some of this lead belcher across those areas that I think are going to catch the most light. So we're just going to put some brightness back into this. So in terms of what I'm looking for, any parts that are facing upwards, generally that big bulge that we've got on the chest armor. And I'm not being overly careful with this, and I am stabbing it with the brush a little bit, just to make sure that I do build up, again, some texture, but also some lightness. Next up, we will do exactly the same, but we'll use some chrome from Vallejo Model Air. Now, if you haven't got this, something like Roomfang Steel from Citadel, absolutely fine. We're going to do exactly the same thing. We're going to stipple this inside the lead belcher from the previous step, where we think the armor is going to be brightest. Also, when it comes to things like the sword and the mace, they're nice sharp edges, so you can just dry brush across those edges to get a nice brighter element on there that'll really stand out on the tabletop. Now, it's time to make this armor a metallic green color. So the color I've gone for is Militarum Green Contrast Paint, and I've thinned this with Contrast Medium. Now, it is 2 parts Contrast Medium to 1 part Militarum Green, so you're going to have a very thin mix. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start to add this onto the armor panels, focusing on the recesses. Now, I'm just going to stipple this on and brush it on in some places, because this is all about building up the color and building up a little bit of texture on top of what we've already put down there. Now, what you'll start to see straight away is you get a very nice automatic transition into the darker green, into the lighter green. But I'm not going overly crazy with this, and you will notice that in the brightest areas, I'm not putting any of this paint on at all. That's because I want to add some Plague Bearer flesh onto these areas, which is a much richer yellowy green colour. But again, I'm not putting this on too heavily. Now, this is thin enough out of the pot. Just make sure you haven't got too much on your brush. And I'm applying this whilst that Militarum green is still a little bit wet, so they will start to dry into each other on the model a little bit as well. So just pop this over the brightest areas, and you'll start to see that you get a very nice rich green, and that metallic paint underneath is still showing through all these layers as well. and it'll really start to pop. Once all that's dry, I'm going to go back in with a second layer of Militarum green contrast paint. Again, the same mix with the same amount of contrast medium in there. I'm going to focus this towards some of the recesses, but also across where we've got that blend a little bit, just to smooth it out with the Plague Bearer flesh. And in some areas I'm brushing this, in some areas I'm stippling it. Again, it's just building up some of that texture. And finally, when that Militarum green is completely dry, we're going to go back in again with some Plague Bearer flesh and just add this over those areas that are going to catch the most light. They should be the brightest parts of the model, so it should be easy to identify. And this is going to give you that really nice metallic, nurgly green colour. And like I said, this was a little bit of experimentation, but once it's dry, I'm really, really happy with how it's turned out. Next up, it's time to paint all of the rust. Now, there's quite a lot of rust across the model. So the colour reason for this is Doombull Brown, and I've thinned this down with a lot of water. So if I put a little bit of Doombull Brown on a dry palette, I'd probably mix it down with about 3 or 4 parts water. Make sure it's well mixed in, and this is going to be very runny, but it's still quite a powerful colour. What I'm looking to do is to just pop this into all of the areas where I want some rust. So I'm looking at all the pock marks in the armour, I'm looking around all the rivets. For all that chain link, I'm going to just painted across all there, making sure it goes into the gaps. When it comes to that mace, which is nice and rusty, I pretty much paint the entire thing with the Doombull Brown as well. And then also on the sword, there's some decay and pock marks on there. So I'm going to make sure I fill those in as well. Although I am going for slightly bigger areas on the sword, but make sure you stipple it on. Don't paint it on like a layer. And put this anywhere that you want rust. Well, that's completely dry, and again, it's very important that it is completely dry. I'm going to do exactly the same thing again using some Scrag Brown. Now, it's 1 part Scrag Brown to about 3 or 4 parts water, so it's very thin. And again, we're just going to pop it into those pockmark areas where we've already painted Doombull Brown. And what this does, it just adds some depth to the rust and simulates fresh rust. So it just looks like it's constantly evolving, constantly moving on the model. Again, pop this into all the recesses, pop it into the recess of that chain link as well, the chainmail on the mace, also onto the sword as well, but this is a bit more refined, so we're not using as much Scrag Brown as we did Doombull Brown earlier. The last thing I'm going to do with all the rust is just to really help it stand out. And it's not something I normally do. I normally stop at Scrag Brown, but I just want to add a little bit more brightness to it. So I'm going to take some Troll Slayer Orange. And what I'm looking to do here, again, thin it down a little bit, but just the normal amount you would. And I just want to pop this into some of the deeper recesses. So for example, we've got the links on the chainmail coming down underneath that belly. We've got the pock marks on the sword, some of the pock marks on the armor, and around any of the rivets on that mace as well, because it just adds more variation, texture and tone, so it just gives it a lot more visual interest. Next up, we'll paint all of, I'm going to call them copper areas, which is more like the darker gold areas. So we've got the belt buckle, we've got the Nurgle fly emblem, we've got the hilt of the sword, anything like that that's going to be that darker gold color. Don't forget the bell, of course, on the antlers. I'm going to paint all of these using Balthazar gold. So just take your time, because we are working around bits we've already finished. That armor is now done, so we want to be careful around it and just build this layer up. I'm then going to take some Hachette copper and use this to highlight exactly the same areas I've just painted using Balthazar gold. Generally, I'm not going to be massively careful in terms of how I highlight. I'm going to highlight the majority of these bits. It's just to get that brightness back in there. Then I'll shade it all down using some Coelia green shade, which is a really nice dark bluey green color, and this will give you a really nice effect on that copper as we start to build up that verdigris. One thing to be mindful of here is that you don't put too much on and just completely cover all of the detail up, so just take your time with that. Lastly, I'm going to take a little bit of Nailac Oxide and use this to do a bit of a patina or verdigris effect across the copper areas. Generally, I'm looking to get this into the recesses, but in some cases, I'm going to paint it over the surface areas as well. Now, start off with a little. You don't need to go wild. Start off with a little, and you can always build it up, because it's easier to do that than it is to put too much on and then find that you've got to go back in and repaint areas. Moving on to all of that flesh on Gelgus Pust next, and this is why I was really important to have that Mechanicus grey prime on there so that it's going to make this step a little bit easier. I'm going to paint all of the flesh using Ogren Camo. Now, this is a layer paint. It can be a little bit thin, and I'd encourage you to add a little bit of water so it does flow smoothly, because we want this flesh to be as smooth as possible. It did take me 3 layers to cover all of the flesh, but once that first layer was down, it did go a little bit quicker. So just take your time with this. You're working around lots of areas you've already finished here, so it's really important that you're clean, neat, and tidy. Once that first flesh layer was down, it was time to start highlighting. Now, I'm not going to use any shades on this because I want the flesh to be nice and bright and just reflect the box art a little bit, where it seems really kind of bloated and disgusting that it could explode at any time. And the first highlight I'm going to do is with Krieg Khaki. Now, again, this did need 2 layers to cover up properly, but the added bonus to that is that when you're painting around some areas, you can use it to your advantage, as it helps to blend in those areas a little bit. Now, I'm not doing any bona fide blending per se on this model. I am going to be doing a little bit of glazing shortly, but generally with this, we just want to paint all of the musculature, leaving the Ogren Camo in the recesses. So again, take your time with this. This is actually, I really enjoyed this stage because it's a very different way to painting flesh than I normally do. I was really happy with how this turned out. Next up, we're going to take a 50-50 mix of Deepkin Flesh and Krieg Khaki. Now, this is a really nice kind of pallid colour. And what I'm looking to do here is just focus the highlight a little more into those areas that are facing upwards, just leaving a bit of Krieg Khaki exposed and obviously leaving that Ogren Camo in the recesses. So I'm working my way across the model here, building up some of that texture. There's lots of different kind of fleshy bits because of how bloated and swollen the model is. It's really disgusting, but I'm really happy with how this is coming together. The last highlight I'm going to do is with Deepkin Flesh, and this is going to be a bit more of a kind of a stipple highlight, I guess, across those areas that are going to be facing upwards, catching the most light, where I really want to emphasize some of the bloating. Now, generally I've thinned this paint down a little bit, but by stippling it on there, again, not necessarily using the point of the brush, but using the side of the brush to get a bit of a larger area, you will start to get that really sickly colour. And if you need to add more on later on, you always can. Similarly, if you need to go back to the previous layers just to tidy bits up, that's really easy and straightforward to do as well. Next up, I wanted to add all of the bruising that you can see on the box art. So I decided to use 2 colours. The first one is Bugman's Glow, which is it's kind of a darker, flashy colour. And I thinned this down using a little bit of water again. So probably, again, about 3-4 parts water, turning this into a bit of a glaze. Now, when you're doing glaze, it's really important to remember a couple of things. The first thing is not to have too much paint on your brush. So always, once you load your brush up, tap it onto a paper towel or a kitchen towel like I use here, and just drag and then take it to the model. When you drag your brush, you want to be using as much of the brush face as possible across the model, so you reduce tide marks, you reduce join lines, but also wherever you end up, wherever the brush stops, that's going to be where the most paint lands. So what you want to make sure is that you're glazing in the direction where you want it to be darkest, which is why I'm glazing towards the armor panels here. And the other thing is you really need to make sure it's completely dry before you go back in and glaze over it again. So a first layer of glaze isn't going to do a huge amount. It might take 3 or 4 layers of glaze to get the effect you want, but by doing it that way and starting a little bit closer to the armor each time, you'll get a nice transition. Now, I wasn't 100% sure which purple colour to go for all that bruising, so I ended up going for Naggaroth Night, which I think's turned out okay. Did exactly the same thing as previously, so I thinned it down into a glaze consistency. And then I just painted it towards the armor panel, but I probably started very close to the armor panel to start with as well, because I wanted that transition to go from the Bugman's Glow into the Naggaroth Night, and that's where I got that bruising. Use this really sparingly because it is a really powerful colour, and if you're not careful, it'll really overpower some of the elements that you've already painted. So with all the bruising done, I just wanted to add a little more contrast to the flesh. So I did this using some Castellan green. Again, I thinned it down to a glaze consistency. So 2, 3, maybe 4 parts water. Depends how thick your paint is. It's a very, very dark green. And what I wanted to do here was just add it into some of those recesses, and I'm focused on the lower part of the arms here, and underneath where you've got the rolls of fat and things like that on the body as well, where you've got the leather belts and things like that. And again, just adds a bit more contrast, so it helps really sell the effect of all the rolls and that. I guess it's like a Michelin Man effect that he's got going on here. Next up, we'll paint all those boils and sores across the model. They're absolutely disgusting, and there are lots of them. The first thing to do is to paint them white. Now, use any white paint that you've got. Normally, I'd use AK white, but I didn't want to use it for this, so I ended up using white Scar. But again, just make sure you've got them all painted. There are loads and loads and loads and loads of them across the model. Be careful not to spill this over any of the flesh. When that white paint is dry, take some Yandan yellow contrast paint and just paint this over the areas that you've just painted white. Now, two things will happen here. Firstly, you get a really bright yellow pussy boil, which looks disgusting. But also you should get a really nice outline on the bottom as well. So you get all of the work done in just one coverage of paint, which saves us a little bit of time, but also gives us a really nice effect. We'll paint the wings next. Now, this was yet another experiment that in my head I thought would work, and actually I'm really happy with how it turned out. So the first thing I did was base them all using Corax White. Now, the reason I've used Corax White is because it covers really nicely, covers well, and it's a little bit of an off-white colour, which is really important for the final effect that we want. We don't want it to be bright white at this point. Once that was completely dry, I went back in with a bright white and just used this to roughly highlight the wings. So you can drag your brush along some of the edges of the wings. In other areas, I just painted them in. I wasn't particularly concerned with how tidy this looked. I just wanted to make sure I had a little bit of a highlight. And that's where you can see the difference between a pure white and the Corax White. I then covered all of the wings using Briar Queen contrast paint. Now, this doesn't necessarily cover fantastically well, but that's exactly what we want. The important thing here is that we don't let it pull too heavily towards the bottom. So rather than slap it on, we just want to paint it on like we would a layer, making sure that we can mop up anything that we got settling towards the bottom of the wings. When that was completely dry, it was time to dirty up the wings a little bit, and to do that, I took some Agrax Earthshade. And what I look to do with this is stipple it, and I started off stippling it towards the bottom of the wings, and this just gives you a really dirty, rotten look to them. Keep stippling as much as you want until you've kind of got roughly a decent effect. But it is really important that you do this slowly and you let it dry in stages. So what I did was I did the bottom kind of third of the wings, let that dry, and then I went back in and added more and more Agrax Earthshade just to build it up and get it into all those recesses until you get some really dirty looking wings. And again, it's really important that you don't let it settle and pool and puddle, but just keep working it in sections. And what you'll start to see is that you get a really nice, disgusting, kind of rotten, browny blue effect on the wings that really does look quite nice on the tabletop. But if you want them to stay bright blue, then don't use as much Agrax Earthshade. But I think it's a really good opportunity to really build this up. Also, while I had the Agrax Earthshade out, I did just paint it over the teeth. So with that, let's paint all of the black elements. Now, there are quite a few across the model, and it goes without saying that you're going to have to be really careful when you apply this because there are so many bits already finished. So the colour I'm using for this is AK Black. If you haven't got that, if you've got a Baden Black, that's absolutely fine. It will work. You just might need a couple of extra layers. So in terms of the things I'm looking to paint with the black, we've got that big, disgusting fly part across the back and the shoulders. We've also got the kind of the bits that come out from those pincers. We've got the edges to the wings as well, which again, you need to be really careful on these because you've already finished the membrane. And we've got things like that little bit of material in the front and the handle for the sword and the mace. The first highlight I'm going to use on the black is Airsheen Grey. Now I'm going to take my time with this and just kind of edge highlight a little bit, but because it is quite a thin colour, I can also stipple it a little bit into bigger fabric areas just to enhance that highlight a little bit. Generally though, across all the model, you can use the shape of it to just drag the brush and get some nice accurate highlights, whether you're doing the hairy part of the fly or whether you're going to, drag it down the wing membranes. It's actually quite straightforward to get a nice crisp highlight using this. Next up, we'll use some Dawnstone, and again, this is exactly the same as we did in the previous step. We just want to keep it inside the Airsheen Grey. So generally, I'm going to drag my brush across the shape of the model to get those nice crisp highlights. I'm going to take my time. I want to make sure that I build it up, and if you do put it on too thickly in any particular places, you can always go back in with the previous colours and use this to just tone it down a little. Now, just to add a little bit of extra brightness across some of the leather straps, I took some greys here, and again, just dragged my brush for a crisp highlight. Next up, we'll paint the antlers and that wreath across Gelgus's head. So to base all of them, I took some Rhinox hide, and just painted this across them. Now, it's important to be careful around areas you have already finished, particularly as you're getting closer to the flesh. So just work your way across them, making sure you've got a nice even coverage and that you've painted all of the antlers. I also used this on the belt around Gelgus's middle. To start the highlighting, I then took some Doombull Brown, and firstly I highlighted the belt. Now I painted the majority of the belt using the Doombull Brown because this is a kind of a mid-tone for me when it comes to leather. For the antlers, I painted half of the antlers completely in Doombull Brown, working my way back from probably about halfway towards the head. And then what I did with the Doombull Brown is I edge highlighted into the Rhinox hide. So what this is doing is this is starting to transition into a lighter colour, like you see on the box art. Now, I'm not going to go as bright as the box art, but I am going to show you how to do that lighter transition. I also used this on the wreath around Gelgus's head as the base coat. The next colour I used was Scrag Brown, so for the leather I just simply dragged it across the edges of the belt to get a nice crisp highlight. And for the antlers, what I did was, again, I painted the back third perhaps of the antler towards the head completely in Scrag Brown, and then I used this to draw out some line highlights into the Doombull Brown from the previous stage. So again, it's continuing the same style and just gives you that at a glance transition. It's not a completely smooth transition, it just tricks the eye enough to make it look that that's what's happening. I also edge highlighted the wreath using this. To finish off the highlights, I took a 50-50 mix of a Shabty Bone and Scrag Brown. And again, I just highlighted, rather than whole parts of the antlers, I just did some line highlighting from the head, probably for that third where I painted the Scrag Brown. And also for the wreath, I just dragged my brush to get some nice crisp highlights. With a Shabty Bone on the palette, I use this to base the skull that we've got hanging off that one thigh plate on Gelgus. There's also a skull on his base, and I also use it to paint all of the fingernails. To add some shading, I took some Agrax Earthshade. Now, I was fairly liberal with this. I was just careful around bits that I'd already finished so that I didn't spill it over some of that flesh in particular. The first highlight was back to some Shabty Bone, and generally what I look to do here on the skulls is just pick out those raised features, such as the top of the forehead, the brow, the cheekbones, and the teeth. When it came to the nails, I just very carefully painted some vertical lines to give the impression of growth and dirt. I finished off the bone areas with a highlight of Screaming Skull, which is a nice bright colour. Again, focusing on the bits that cast the most light, and again, for those nails, I just painted it inside the Shabty Bone. The last major part we've got to do on the model are the hooves. Now, I took some dryad bark for this because I wanted them to be a slightly different brown colour and just very carefully painted them. The other thing I did was I painted, I really don't know what they're called, but we'll call it the mandibles of that fly element on the back. It's the outside half of them. I painted those in dryad bark as well because we'll do a little bit of a transition from black into brown. To get a little bit of depth to that colour, I shaded them all using some Nurgle oil as well. Again, be very careful around bits I'd already finished. And while I was waiting for that to dry, I painted in the gums on Gelgus, and I based all of these using Screamer Pink. Be very, very careful with this. Use it sparingly. Good tip on your brush. And then I highlighted these using some Pink Horror. That Nurgle oil still wasn't quite dry, so I based the eyes using Evil Sun Scarlet. Now again, these are very, very small, and I always struggle to paint eyes on camera, so I did tidy them up off camera a little bit. So with the hooves and those mandibles done, I went back in with dryad bark and just painted some lines down the hooves to give that impression of striation and growth, leaving the Nurgle oil in the recesses. And I did the same thing on the mandibles, and I also just highlighted these back into the black parts a little bit to ease that transition. The last thing I did was take some Gothor Brown and painted this inside the dryad bark from the last stage. It just gives you that really nice highlight and helps bits stand out on the table. So for the hooves, I just painted some very thin lines of the Gothor Brown. And then for those mandibles, I just painted thin lines again inside the dryad bark to really, really sell the effect. And there we have it. Gelgus Pust is done and ready for the tabletop. I'm really, really chuffed with how this model has turned out in terms of some of the experimentation I did, and the final effect is completely different to anything that I've already painted before. I really, really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, leave a like and a comment down below. Don't forget to check out all my other Darkwater content here. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.